Emily Carter sat in her dimly lit apartment, the soft hum of the city outside her window blending with the ticking clock on the wall. Another evening, another silent dinner alone. The glow of her phone screen illuminated her face as she scrolled absent-mindedly, waiting for a message that wouldn't come. Daniel was working late again. He always was. She set her fork down, appetite gone. 10 years of marriage, and yet, she felt more like a ghost in her own home than a wife. She had tried, small gestures, conversations that led nowhere, nights spent hoping he would look at her the way he once did. But love, she realized, didn't fade all at once. It unraveled in the quiet neglect of ordinary days. Her phone vibrated. A name appeared. Jonathan Pierce. Her pulse quickened. She hadn't expected to hear from him. Their encounter at the charity gala had been brief, polite, fleeting. But there had been something about him. The way he listened. The way he held eye contact just a second longer than necessary. Hope you're doing well, Emily. Would love to continue our conversation. Dinner at your place? Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. She shouldn't. It was absurd. But as she glanced at the empty chair across from her, a thought crept in, uninvited. When was the last time someone truly saw me? She typed a response before she could overthink it. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. The soft clink of wine glasses filled the space between them. Emily sat across from Jonathan, candlelight casting shadows along the walls. She had told herself this was just dinner, just conversation, yet something about his presence unsettled her in ways she wasn't ready to admit. "You've built a beautiful home," Jonathan said, swirling his wine. "Feels like you?" She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. It's felt empty for a long time. His gaze held hers. "That's a hard way to live." She looked down, tracing the rim of her glass with her finger. "It wasn't always like this." The words felt like an admission, a crack in the wall she had spent years fortifying. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "Then what changed?" She exhaled slowly. Silence. Distance. The kind that creeps in so slowly you don't even notice until one day you're living with a stranger. The air between them shifted. His hand rested briefly on hers, a touch so fleeting it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. "You deserve to be seen, Emily." His voice was low, certain. A sharp breath caught in her throat. It had been so long since someone had said something like that to her, in a way that felt real. But this was dangerous. This was wrong. She pulled her hand back, forcing a small smile. "I think I've had too much wine." Jonathan studied her for a moment before leaning back, giving her space. He wasn't pushing. He didn't have to. The damage was already done. She stood abruptly, gathering their plates. "It's getting late." He nodded, watching her. "Thank you for tonight." As she walked him to the door, their eyes met again. For a brief second, the pull was undeniable. Then she stepped back. "Good night, Jonathan." She closed the door, heart pounding, hands trembling. She had just danced on the edge of something irreversible. The sound of the key turning in the lock sent a jolt through Emily's spine. She hadn't expected Daniel home this early. The plates were still on the table, the wine glasses half empty. The scent of Jonathan's cologne lingered in the air. Daniel stepped inside, setting his briefcase down. His eyes swept over the room, narrowing slightly at the remnants of a dinner that wasn't meant for him. "You had company," he said, more observation than question. Emily forced a casual tone. "A friend." Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the extra wine glass. The silence between them stretched, heavier than ever. She could feel the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing down, suffocating. He walked past her, loosening his tie. "How was your night?" Something in his voice made her stomach twist. It wasn't anger. It wasn't suspicion. It was something worse, detached indifference. "Fine," she said, barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't ask anything more. He moved to the bedroom, closing the door behind him without another word. She stood frozen, a lump forming in her throat. This was what hurt the most. Not accusations, not confrontation, just nothing. Later that night, unable to bear the silence, she stepped into their room. Daniel was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "I need to ask you something," she said, voice unsteady. He didn't look at her. "All right. Are we happy?" The words came out before she could stop them. A long pause. Then he sighed. "I don't know." Her chest tightened. "Do you even love me anymore?" Daniel finally met her eyes. "Of course I do. But do you?" The question hit harder than she expected. She opened her mouth, then closed it. What was she supposed to say? That she didn't know anymore? That she had let another man make her feel something she hadn't felt in years? His voice softened. "Emily, when did we stop trying?" She felt tears sting her eyes. "I don't know." They sat in silence, the distance between them more than just physical. Emily stared at the ceiling in the dark, listening to Daniel's steady breathing beside her. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the evening, the look in his eyes, the weight of his words. She had spent so much time feeling unseen that she hadn't stopped to consider whether she had been looking at him at all. Her phone sat on the nightstand. One message, and she could reopen a door she had barely closed. She picked it up, thumb hovering over Jonathan's name. Then, with a deep breath, she deleted the conversation. The next morning, she sat across from Daniel at the kitchen table. For the first time in years, she spoke without rehearsing. "I don't want us to disappear." His eyes lifted to meet hers. "Neither do I." She hesitated. "Then why does it feel like we already have?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I think I got too comfortable. I assumed we'd always be here, no matter how much space I put between us." He looked down. "I didn't mean to make you feel alone." Her throat tightened. "I let it happen too." A long pause stretched between them, but it didn't feel like the usual empty silence. It felt like something shifting, something breaking open. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Do you still believe in us?" Emily's chest ached at the question. It would have been easier to say no, to walk away, to let someone like Jonathan fill the void. But love wasn't about filling spaces. It was about choosing, even when it was hard. "I want to," she said finally. "But we have to try." His fingers brushed hers across the table. A small touch, uncertain but real. "Then let's try." For the first time in a long time, she felt something other than emptiness. It wasn't passion, wasn't certainty. But it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough.